One of the most important features in any tiling window manager is the built-in layouts, especially for dynamic tilers. It's all about the layouts, so that's one of the most important things you want to hack on when you get into the config file. So today I'm going to show you how to configure your built-in layouts that are in Qtile. Let's get started. So the first thing we should do is pull up a web browser, and you should navigate to Qtile.org. This is the official Qtile website, and this is where their official documentation is. And the documentation for Qtile is great. And in the search field here, just do a search for built-in layouts, and you will get the second result here, built-in layouts. Pull up that page, and this will list every single layout that is available for you in Qtile. If I switch back to my desktop for a second, you will see some of the layouts that I am using. This box right here that says monad tall, that is the current layout here, which is of course the master and stack layout, which is kind of one of the default layouts in Xmonad, the master and stack, but Qtile calls it monad tall. If I switched layouts here, I could go to a max layout where all the windows are actually stacked on top of each other, but full screen, max mode. One of the other layouts I'm currently using is one called tree mode, where similar to max, they are stacked on top of each other, but instead of being full screen, there's this little side panel here. And I could switch between the windows. Now all the windows look the same because they're just empty terminals right now. But that is an interesting little layout. I don't really use it, but you know what? We might hack on this layout later. Some other layouts I have enabled. Floating layout, of course, where the windows just float. And then I'm back to monad tall. Now there are many, many more layouts than that built into Qtile. For example, floating, which I was already using, was one of the first ones. There is a layout called BSP, which, as you can probably guess, it tries to emulate one of the default layouts, if you will, in BSPWM. There's a layout called columns, which I'm also not using. Matrix is another layout. Max and monad tall I was already using. They have monad wide, which we may play around with. You know what? I may just go ahead and enable every single built-in layout in Qtile just for purposes of this video. So how would I do that? I'm going to pull up a desktop here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to pull up my Qtile config. And this is my personal Qtile config that's been hacked on over a number of years, and it's got a ton of customization to it. But I think what we should also do is we should pull up the default Qtile config, the pre-hacked Qtile config. So let me just quickly do a vertical split here, and what I will do is I will find my copy of the default config because I saved one. I've got the default Qtile config on the left pane. Hasn't been hacked on in any way. This is the default config you get when you install Qtile for the first time, and then I get my hacked on personal Qtile config on the right pane. That way we have a little bit of a comparison. So if we start with the default config on the left-hand pane, let me go ahead and find the section in the config that discusses layouts. So I'm going to page down. I just paged down one time on line 77 here. You have layouts equals, and then in brackets, there's only two layouts enabled by default, the max layout and the stack layout. And then in the parentheses outside the word stack, you also have this key here, number of stacks equals 2. So it's telling you exactly how many stacks are in the stack layout. Now, obviously, that's variable, right? You could change that from 2 to 3 or 4 or whatever, however many number of stacks you want in the stack layout. So to add additional layouts here, the first thing you would need to do is, well, you know what? Go back to the built-in layouts page in the official Qtile documentation and pick some of the layouts you want to try. It gives you their name, floating, for example, in the first case here, libqtile.layout.Floating. Floating is the Python library you need to import and able to use that. Now, by default, Qtile imports the entire libqtile.layout library. So every built-in layout that's available in Qtile, you're able to just add. You don't need to bother importing any libraries. If you had to, though, you would go to the top of the file and you would, add a line like from libqtile import layout. But it's already there, so you don't have to bother. So let's go back down to the layout section of the config. And let's go ahead and add a layout. One thing you need to know before you start adding layouts is every line here, if we start adding, additional layouts, needs to end with a comma, except for the very last line. This is important. This will break your config if you add a comma to the last line, or if you fail to add a comma to some of the lines that are not the last line in this list. So just throwing that out there for you. So let's add a layout. Since we were just talking about the floating layout, let's add it. So all you would need to do is, let's go ahead and just add a line here and type layout.Floating and then parentheses. We don't need to put anything in the parentheses unless we want to edit the floating layout. Remember to add the comma at the end. And then all I would need to do is save the config file, restart Qtile, and I would now have a floating layout. Now inside the parentheses, I could define a few things. So if I go back to the browser here, each built-in layout in Qtile, you'll see it has a chart. You have keys and the value that is the default for that key, and then the description of what that key actually does. For example, we have border focus. So anytime the floating window in floating mode has focus, this is its border color. Of course, I could change that. Or border normal, which appears to be black. Border width appears to be just 1 pixel. So, I could go in here and do something like, and get back inside the parentheses, and I could do something like, I don't know, border underscore focus was one of the keys, and then equals, and then by default, it was in single quotes, and it was 000 FF. But I could change it to any color. I could just do FFF for white is what that color is. And I can make the border of a focus window inside floating mode have a white border. And maybe I don't want that border to be 1 pixel, which is what it is by default, according to the documentation. So I'll do a comma, and I will also go ahead and do border underscore width equals. And then this time, instead of 1, which is the default, I'm going to make it 4 pixels wide. And because it's a number, 4, I don't need to wrap that in quotes. If I were to write this and then restart Qtile, my new floating mode would also now have a new border color. When its windows have focus, it would be the color white. And the border width of all the floating windows would now be 4 pixels wide instead of the default, which is 1 pixel wide. And that's how you would really do all of this. You would just go in here. It's not that hard. When I tell people to read things like read the wiki and read the documentation for things, I guess until you see somebody actually do it in action, you just go in here. And if I wanted to add the BSP layout, I just go back and just very quickly, I just add a new line, right? I can get in here and layout.Bsp parentheses, and remember to add the comma at the end. And if I don't like the default BSP layout, the border width and the padding and whatever happens to be some of the keys for it, I get in here and see the things I can change. And there's a few things I can change. And if I wanted to, for example, margin, the margin of the layout is set to 0, meaning no margin. Maybe I want a gap around everything in the BSP layout. So if I wanted to, I could go in here and I could quickly just margin equals, and then instead of 0, I could do, I don't know, a 6 pixel margin around everything in that particular layout. Now, this is, not a config I can show you in action. This is the default config. This is actually my config. So let's actually, I should just close this one altogether. I don't really need this default config. So this is my config. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit here for you guys to see my config. If I page down to my layouts, you will see you get to a section here in my config file. You can find my config on GitLab, gitlab.com/DWT1. And my GitLab link is in all my show's descriptions. All you guys are always asking about my configs and everything. My config files for pretty much everything I use is on my GitLab page. Anyway, I have a section here called Layouts, where I define a few things. It doesn't look the same as the default config, but that's fine. You can hack on the default config, but you can kind of see what I do here. First of all, this section here is, a init layout themes, and then I define a few things. Border width is 2, margin is 4. The border focus, meaning the windows with focus always have this color. Normal windows always have a border of that color. And I'm setting this because I'm going to use multiple layouts, and many layouts have the same keys available to them. I just want to set it for all the layouts. So when I go down here and I have define init layouts, and then here are all the layouts that are not enabled. You see I have these commented out. These are built-in layouts inside Qtile. I have them in my config mainly for you guys, so you guys know that they're available, but I have these commented out because I don't use these. I don't like these layouts. They're not something I use in my workflow, but if you guys want to use them, all you would have to do is just come in here and, just uncomment the layouts. Me personally, this zoomy layout is kind of weird. I don't like it, but try them out. Matter of fact, since they're all built in already, just go in your default Qtile config and just add everything from that page, from the documentation. Add all 15 or 20 built-in layouts. Try them all out. See what works for you. See what doesn't work for you. And you see by default in my layout, I have things like layout.monad_tall, and then in parentheses I have ** layout theme. Same thing, layout.max ** layout theme. What does that mean? It means I'm not really defining any keys except for these 4 right here. These 4 are always good. I always want to set the same border width, margin, and border colors, no matter the layout. The only thing is some layouts will not honor some of these. For example, margin works in almost every layout, but the max layout, of course, the full screen layout, has no margins around the window. So that just gets ignored in the max layout. So of the layouts that I have enabled, the only one I really hacked on a little bit to play around with was that weird tree tab layout. If I go back to the tree tab layout here, you can see tree tab is this weird layout. All the windows are stacked on top of each other, and then they are also thrown in this panel here on the side. If I opened up a second terminal, for example, I could swap between them here in this panel, in this tree view. I guess kind of like a nerd tree kind of view if you're used to using something like nerd tree and Vim. I'm not really happy with this tree tab layout as far as what I configured. I just played on it for a little bit just to play with it, right? Just to see what was possible with it. And all I did is I went down and I found the tree tab layout here, and added layout.TreeTab to my config. And then it has a ton of keys. Like, this is one of the most configurable layouts in Qtile. And what I did is I just kind of tried it out a little bit. For example, I changed the font to the Ubuntu font. The font size is 10 pixels, and that is the font here in this tree tab bar on the side. I created 2 sections in tree tab. Initially, I didn't even know this was possible, and then later I discovered, man, you can add separate sections to tree tab where I could actually send my config file from the first section where you see both the terminal and the Emacs, my config file open. They're in this first section, but if I wanted to, I set a key binding. Control, Shift, and J will move it down to the second group of windows where I could open up some other stuff and have some other programs in this second group of programs here inside the tree tab view. And if I wanted to, I could move this back up to the first group of workspaces and then cycle between those two and then move it to the second group of workspaces. Anyway, I'm just going to close this out. So let me get back into my config. That was showing you a little bit of what you can do configuring some of these layouts. And all of these layouts have these keys that you can add. They have all at least have one key anyway. All of them you can change the name of the layout. The name of the layout is what appears in the Qtile panel. You see tree tab is the default name for tree tab, but if I wanted to, I could get in here and I could do something like name equals, and then in quotes I could do something like tree view if I preferred that name, and then don't forget the comma at the end because that's not the last line. If I were to escape right now, let me go ahead and escape, and you know what, let's go ahead and write, and let's restart Qtile. Alright, and let's get back into the tree tab view. And you see, instead of tree tab in my panel, it actually says tree view. So that actually did take effect. I actually just prefer the name tree tab since that's the real name of that layout. So I'm going to delete that line and I'm going to go ahead and write again and restart Qtile. and go back to that layout, and it is back to being called tree tab as before. One of the things I want to do before I go, I'm going to go back up here and I'm going to uncomment all these layouts that I had not been using. Now these are built-in layouts in Qtile. Let's show you guys these layouts in action. So I'm just going to enable everything. Let me escape to get back into normal mode. I'm going to write, and let's restart Qtile. And I'm going to have a billion layouts in this thing. So let me get to an empty workspace where you can see this in action. By default, monad.Tall is my first workspace. Let me open up, I don't know, about 4 windows, 4 terminal windows. This is monad.Tall, your traditional master and stack layout. The next one would be the max layout. The next one would be tree tab. The next one would be floating, where all your windows are floating. This is monad wide. Now this is a master and stack layout, but instead of monad.Tall, where you have columns, you have a column of a master window and then the stack. You have rows, the master row and then the stack row. Then you also have something called the BSP layout. I'm not exactly sure what this is doing though. It looks like it's just opening windows and columns. No, it eventually divides it into grids. You guys see what that's doing there? Let me start from the beginning, because this is interesting. So I got 1 window, then let me open up 2, and then it's going to start dividing these 2 windows. And then it's going to start dividing the top 2 windows, I think. Yeah. Or the top windows, or the left-hand pane of windows. And then it should divide the right-hand pane of windows. And then it goes back. Yeah, that is kind of interesting. I'm not sure if I would find that layout useful, but it's an interesting layout. You guys might like it. This is the stack, where you have 2 different stacks. All your windows are either stacked in the left-hand pane or the right-hand pane. By default, it put all 5 or 6 terminals in that left-hand pane, but I could, have 2 different stacks of stuff going on here. And this is, of course, a column to layout. This is ratio tile. Ratio tile is your typical kind of grid layout, where it keeps dividing the screen into equal parts as best as it can. The next layout is vertical tile, pretty self-explanatory. And then you have a tile layout. It kind of looks like master and stack, but I'm not sure what the difference is. And you got 1 big window, and then you start a stack. Now the bigger window takes up a little bit more than half of the space, but you can do that in a master and stack mode too. So I'm not sure what the difference between the monad.Tall, the master and stack layout, and the tiled layout is. I have to read through the documentation on that. This one here is called the matrix layout. Let's see what that is. So it opens 1 window on 1 half of the screen. That's a little weird. I don't know why it wouldn't take up the whole screen. The next one, it takes up the other half. Then the next one, yeah, that's weird. It always has that empty space for the next window. I'm not sure why I would want that. I don't think I would. The next layout is one called zoomy. Now this is really weird. So you have this big window that takes up almost the whole screen, except it leaves a little sliver of your wallpaper on the right hand side. And if I open up a next one, you see the old window actually. Let me close this window and let me launch HTOP. I'm going to launch HTOP. Now I'm going to open up a new window. HTOP gets pushed into this very small corner until I hover over it. If I hover over it, it'll switch places. And of course, as I open things, it'll keep pushing stuff into that right-hand column. And it's called zoomy because when I hover over it, it swaps places just for a moment as I swap focus. I'm sure I could do that with the keyboard as well. Very strange. Very strange. And of course, this is the traditional master and stack layout. Now let me get back into my config. And quite frankly, I did not like any of those layouts besides the ones I had been using. So I'm just going to go back and comment out all those. And let me go ahead and write that and reload my actual config file and get back into my normal Qtile config. Anyway, I'm going to close my config. That is just a little bit on how to work with workspaces here in Qtile. I hope you guys found this useful, those of you that are trying out Qtile, or those of you that are trying out tiling window managers in general. Watching a video like this with me, digging in the documentation of Qtile and hacking on Qtile a little bit, really that helps you no matter what tiling window manager you're hacking on, because you get to see the process, right? It's not all about the actual lines of code and, the things specifically that I'm doing. It's all about the mindset. Get in there, dig around, find what you're looking for, and make it happen. Now, before I go, I need to thank a few special people. This episode was made possible by Ansem Chris, Daniel David, DJ Stallman, Donnie Dillon, George Haplo, Nate, Corbinian, Lambda, Liam Mitchell, Natek, Rob, Robert, Sean, and Willie. They are the producers of the show, my highest tier patrons over on Patreon. Without these guys, this episode about configuring your layouts in Qtile would not have been possible. The show is also brought to you by all those other names you see on the screen. All those fine ladies and gentlemen help support my work over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider doing so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace.